Hello everyone, let's discuss today's The Hindu editorial page. The first article is State of the Economy, Temper the Euphoria. In this article, the writer says that the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has revised its projected GDP growth rate for India for 2023 to 24 to 6.3%, up from the earlier 6.1%. This success is sweeter as the IMF revised downwards the world GDP growth projection, including China's by 0.3 percentage points to 4.2%. Official spokespersons have sought the IMF's endorsement to silence its critics. The IMF has widely acknowledged that the economies that were worst affected during the COVID-19 pandemic were also the ones to record a steep recovery. India, which was one of the worst affected, has followed the pattern. In the second quarter of 2020, India's GDP contracted by 25.6%, quarter on quarter, the worst among the world's major economies. The output contraction in 2020 to 21 was 8.5% over the previous year, and real per capita income level in 2021 to 22 was higher than that in 2019 to 20 by about 600. In the following year, 2022 to 23, recovery gained momentum as domestic supplies were restored and global supply chains were straightened out. However, efforts are cause for concern as their effects on employment, quality and persistence of inflation of essential food items affect the poor the most. Even focusing on output recovery, a sectoral view with trade dimension, would expose weaknesses on the armor. Policymakers need to temper their optimism by taking a slightly longer view with a wider angle, appreciating the fast-changing geopolitical underpinnings of economic policy making. India's immediate concern is its soaring deficit with China. India's economic falterity has increased even as the net exports to GDP ratio has sharply declined. India's dependence on Chinese imports of manufacturers seems structural and not easily corrected by changes in relative prices. In May 2020, the government initiated the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan amidst the Galwan crisis to curb Chinese imports of critical industrial products. China accounts for 15%, 16% of India's imports, and a third of India's trade deficit. The trade deficit continues to rise, but it is a steady decline in India's exports. The IMF's revised downwards world GDP growth projection, including China's, is a reminder of the importance of understanding the fast-changing geopolitical underpinnings of economic policy making. The next article is Building the Floor Moves by the US. China to stabilize their rocky relations hold lessons for India. In this article, the writer says that the summit meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in San Francisco has offered the promise of much-needed relief by stabilizing a relationship that has recently been in free fall. The summit on the sidelines of APEC yielded two significant takeaways. The first involved several concrete agreements, including to restart military-to-military direct dialogue and discuss risk and safety issues with artificial intelligence. The second was to establish a floor to the relationship, which was the goal when the two leaders last met in Bali in 2022. However, the Bali consensus was blown away by the spy balloon incident. There is cautious optimism that this attempt at stabilization has been built on more solid ground, but the duration of this stability remains an open question, especially with two potentially disruptive political events looming on the horizon. The longer-term concern is a basic point of difference in how the two leaders see the future of their relations. Mr. Xi criticized the US framing of the relationship as being fundamentally competitive, saying it would lead to misinformed policymaking, misguided actions, and unwanted results. He asked China to refrain from flirting and crossing the lines on issues, including Taiwan and export controls. Dialogue in and of itself is not a concession, and building a floor when ties between major powers are at the risk of free fall is the first step. The next article is from the Hindu Business Line. The article is Climate Change. Are we close to collective action? In this article, the writer says that a new report by the United Nations has reiterated the need for more action and delivery of stronger commitments by countries to avert the climate crisis. The Paris Agreement's target of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is said to be breached due to the insufficiency of existing national climate action plans. Climate change is a global problem and requires global solutions. The report highlights the failure of the multilateral mechanism to combat climate change, as set up under the aegis of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Countries are failing to deliver collectively, with decisions concerning climate action being left to individual nations. However, emission reduction targets have fallen short of what is necessary to curb global climate change, that is, to cut emissions by 43% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. Government leaders also pledged targets several years into the future, which holds little credibility for democratic economies. In terms of carbon neutrality, the targets go even further ahead, with India projecting net zero emissions by 2070, China by 2060, and the US and Europe by 2050. Many net zero targets are uncertain and postpone immediate climate action into the future. National strategies to counter climate change are necessary to account for contextual differences. To keep targets on track, mandatory international review and progress reporting may be a better recourse for transparency in climate action, policy learning, and to bridge the gap between ambitious implementation paths and reality. Multilateral negotiations on climate change are based on the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability. Developed countries, historically high GHG emitters, are required to undertake binding commitments to reduce emissions and provide appropriate financing to the lesser developed countries for their transition towards a low-carbon pathway. However, it can be questioned whether such multilateral principles misalign incentives and dissect the sense of urgency from global climate action. UNFCCC has a role to play in addressing climate change, but it is crucial to recognize that the UNFCCC's mandate is not sufficient to address the urgent need for global action. The UNFCCC's role is to ensure that countries are working together to achieve climate change goals and to work towards achieving this goal.